Okay, this is the advanced segment of Introduction to Psychobiology. So I'll carry on from the first segment. It should be watched before watching this one. The sensory track we talked about, which carries the sensory experience of the moment the trauma was created, that's highly involved in the kind of manifestation of the trauma construct, how it manifests physically. So, for example, if you have a trauma construct with a significant amount of guilt, this trauma construct will weigh on the body much heavier. This guilt is like a kind of burning knife stuck inside of you. And I guess that's an adaptive mechanism where, if at the species level somebody does something which compromises the tribe, their trauma will be quite vivid in an attempt to counteract that. There's also the same kind of amplification of trauma related to blood. Any trauma which contains the sensory vibration of blood becomes kind of hyper manifesting. It really wants to heal, and it really strongly projects itself out into your reality in an attempt to heal. You can imagine this is a kind of population level survival construct. If you have a population and certain members of the population are starting to have a lot of traumas with blood around, with sensory component of blood in them, something's gone really wrong at the species level if there's lots of blood everywhere. And so by writing the blood into the sensory track of the trauma, you create hyper manifestation in an attempt to kind of change the path of the individual or species. So this is where this concept of black magic and blood as a magical item comes from. It's because anytime it's around, there's kind of hyper manifestation happening. There are a number of other kind of intricacies about certain vibrations and things that can get stuck inside the sensory track of traumas, including drugs and heavy metals, mold, things like that. We'll go over in another video. There's another thing called trauma constellations. This came from the German New Medicine modality. They basically found that if you have certain traumas back to back, which are conceptually related, the body creates higher order trauma constructs, more advanced kind of trauma programs to deal with that. So it's basically a system that's created if the normal system of trauma is not working properly and you get many traumas in a row or many traumas in the same time, then a constellation is created. And this has kind of higher order behavioral changes. So one of the really common ones is the flying constellation. They call it this because people, due to a number of fear traumas, they'll get kind of pushed upward in their perception to unground them and help them see things from above, conceptually understand the situation better so they can change it. Often these people have a lot of dreams of flying away from a predator. So this comes from two back-to-back traumas where you're kind of shocked or scared, etc. It can be a permutation of different things, but that's basically the general idea. So I had this one trigger in me when I was a kid. Quite stupid. We were just in the woods doing stupid kid stuff and lighting fireworks or something, and a jogger just appeared out of nowhere and just shocked the hell out of us. And we ran off, and we were like, man, that was crazy. That guy just appeared. And then all of a sudden, from the other direction, he was on this weird jogging path, and he just surprised us again, just a minute later. So what happened is the first trauma construct first event created a trauma construct. And then before that could settle, he caught us off guard again, and the exact same kind of archetypal trauma appeared from a different angle. And, the body saw that the first trauma construct didn't prevent the shock of the second one. So it decided to make this higher order programming, and it's the flying constellation. It just kind of pushes you upward in your perception, makes you spacey, makes you ungrounded, but also quite conceptual and quite good at looking at the big picture. But this trauma construct is quite noisy for perception, so it's a good one to reintegrate. Another example of a constellation is one that often causes anxiety. So this constellation is produced when you have a fear of, from behind you, a fear of getting in trouble, a fear of a predator. You have a fear metaphorically behind you, and at the same time, you have a fear in front of you. There's a fear of walking into a dangerous situation or moving into danger. So I had this one activate also, and really kind of straightforward setup. I was going to a concert for my friend's birthday, like many hours away. We're going to drive. I was quite young to be kind of going off on alone and doing this thing, but my parents let me. And then right before I left, I was quite hyped up, and my mom said, "Oh no, I don't think you can do that. You can't do that." And so I'd already made plans and was so excited. And so kind of for the first time, I was just like, didn't listen to my mom and just went anyway. And on the way to the concert, I had this kind of trauma of like, oh no, I'm going to get in trouble. My mom's going to kill me for this kind of fear of the predator on the back of the neck. But then, this concert was in quite a dangerous city, and it was quite like an alternative concert, and I just knew there was going to be hectic and potentially dangerous, and it created this trauma of I'm moving into a dangerous situation, with the thyroid. And so both those traumas being created in the exact same event linked up, and it created this anxiety constellation, which is meant to kind of take you out of this position where you feel like you can't move backward, you can't move forward. It kind of helps you disassociate, but at the same time, this constellation kind of goes under stress, or something goes haywire as it links to other constellations, and it causes anxiety attacks. So that's something to think about. If you have anxiety, it's often caused by a situation where you feel like you can't go backward and can't go forward. So we'll talk about more kind of advanced concepts in the study of consciousness, and one of them is the conceptual plane. We have many different layers of reality which express the same kind of core constructs in the collective. And one of the most useful and powerful is the conceptual plane. It's kind of the highest layer of reality we can access. And to help you understand, the conceptual plane is kind of a layer of reality that only includes energetic symbols, kind of core concepts for the operation of reality, and most of it is energetic and vibrational, but it's always anchored by a symbol. And it looks kind of like a comic book would. Everything's quite cartoonish and metaphorical and archetypal, and everything follows kind of common archetypes which appear over and over again. They manifest in our reality in stories, fairy tales, etc. For one example, Jung talked quite a lot about the hero's journey archetype. So this is a layer of reality that kind of holds all the archetypes, all the concepts, all the energetic signatures. And this is the most important layer of reality for understanding trauma, because the way trauma works is it's not always the most emotionally difficult event which manifests as trauma in the body. It's actually a combination of kind of emotional impact multiplied by conceptual strength. For example, if you have a trauma that's quite cartoonish, it's going to be significantly more traumatizing than if it was quite abstract and logical. This is actually why cartoon violence for kids is so traumatizing. It's because actually watching, this Roadrunner cartoon watching the Roadrunner get killed by a coyote over and over again, and all these kind of archetypal, conceptual cartoon scenarios is actually probably more traumatizing to the psyche than watching like a kung fu movie that looks kind of silly and exaggerated movements and not very conceptual. To the kind of raw consciousness, the cartoon violence is actually much more impactful. So this is kind of how you can become traumatized without realizing you have trauma. You run into a situation that's very cartoonish that fits an archetype of trauma, and your consciousness kind of snaps and activates a program, whereas maybe you emotionally could have handled it and felt okay about it. So the concept of conceptual shock is when you run into an archetype that's so conceptually shocking because it perfectly fits an archetype that would be in the body. One example of conceptual shock is a client I had previously who was a little kid, a little baby, and he was running around the backyard carefree, and then all of a sudden out of nowhere he switched directions and he ran straight into a clothesline that hit him right in the middle of the throat, and it knocked him down. And most people wouldn't consider that a highly traumatizing event, but if you think about it from the conceptual plane, if you think about how he's just observing reality and seeing green grass and having fun, and then all of a sudden out of nowhere he just gets hit in the throat, it's the same construct as kind of a beheading trauma, a trauma of your head being detached from your body. And this kind of one event anchored super deep in his body and his consciousness. And when he finally released it, it was like, 10, 15 minutes of straight screaming, just full lung screaming, just due to the sheer amount of trauma energy that was packed into his body, because it's an equation of conceptual shock multiplied by kind of emotional tension. He didn't have a huge amount of emotional tension getting hit out of nowhere, but the conceptual shock was incredibly extreme. So this is something to look out for and something to be aware of. And this is how things like MK Ultra, trauma-based mind control work, is you're kind of put in conceptually shocking situations to create huge reservoirs of trauma, which can absorb programming. So traumas also exist on the conceptual plane. It's also possible to have kind of higher dimensional trauma. And this happens when concepts themselves are traumatized, when a core archetype in your life is destroyed. So, for example, one quite common setup is if you're young and there's something blocking your mother from loving you, from properly nurturing you, and it doesn't matter it doesn't necessarily matter what it is. It could be that she's quite anxious or worried about money, or she has a drug problem or personality disorder. If there's just something that blocks your energetic connection to your mother, your core archetype of your mother can be compromised on the conceptual plane. And when this happens, similar to the flying constellation, it pushes your perception up conceptually, so you become a problem solver, so you see the world differently, but it also kind of makes you take on more autistic characteristics, and it's not great for grounding and living in this world. So it's quite easy to repair, if you had something blocking you and your mother's connection. Just imagine your mother as she exists now, kind of on the conceptual plane, on the astral plane. Just imagine her standing there, and imagine, for example, she's so worried about money that she can't properly love you. She can't probably give you all the love that you need. So you just imagine that mom. Then next to her, you imagine the perfect mom that is super abundant and gives you everything you need. And you just feel into that and imagine her and kind of empower that construct, observe it, and then look at the two together and imagine them smashing together and kind of imagine sucking them inside of your heart. And this process can repair concepts on the conceptual plane. Can do the same kind of process with many other concepts. Your concept of a home can get broken if you have a trauma where you're homeless, or you're put out of a home, or the place you're living is really unhome-like, like it's really sketchy, or etc. This can really affect you deeply, so it's worth exploring these kinds of things. Concepts can also be traumatized in another way. They can kind of be smashed together. So, for example, if you have an abusive partner and you guys always get into fights and then you always have makeup sex, it's possible that your concept of intimacy can be kind of smashed into anger. So on the conceptual plane, the symbol for intimacy will kind of be glued to the symbol for anger, and this will manifest everywhere in your life and will really affect you negatively. And so same process in reverse. You imagine the two concepts smushed together and then just imagine them separate and kind of suck that scene into your heart and just set the intention to integrate that. Okay, so we'll talk about some kind of supernatural aspects of trauma constructs, the kind of magical side, which is something we talked about previously, the blueprints. When you heal a trauma construct, you develop an energetic signature of this process, and it's transmissible. If you tell somebody about your healing process and they have the kind of same construct, it very often will spontaneously heal for them. And these things, they seem to work through a field effect. They can transmit just by being near somebody and them observing your movements and hearing your voice. They kind of work, they're kind of amplified in groups. These blueprints become exponentially more powerful as like groups work together on this type of thing. They're kind of collectible. If you heal a lot of trauma constructs in your body, you become kind of this antenna of healing just naturally for those around you, particularly by speaking your experience or giving case studies. This is really important, and this is kind of a population level evolution mechanism. And probably the most important thing we can be doing in this world is creating healing blueprints and kind of uploading them to other people. Another transmissible aspect of healing is what we call postcards. When somebody's telling you a traumatic story, they're telling you an experience they had, as you're listening to the story and you're painting a picture in your mind, you'll see kind of a postcard pop up with images and symbolism, etc. from the story. These postcards are actually kind of where your extrasensory perception aims at. These postcards are conceptual representations of everything you're experiencing from the other person, most of which is nonverbal and energetic, particularly through the frequencies in their voice. So these postcards you see in your mind as somebody tells you a story, this is your kind of third eye's perception of the energetic component of that story. So you'll notice somebody's telling like a really hard story, and you're painting kind of a picture in your mind, and then they get to a really intense part or a really conceptually shocking part, and all of a sudden you see a super clear mental image in your mind, and it even disturbs you a little bit. You can feel it, you can feel the emotions, it just really hits you. This is what happens when you perceive somebody's trauma construct activation. So if you're a kind of good psychobiology practitioner, a lot of it's intuitive. You just simply listen to the client until you see like a really bright, intense mental image pop up, and that's a good indication to dig into that moment and see if a trauma construct kind of activated for them. These postcards are also quite useful in the affirmation stage as you're creating affirmations to overwrite trauma constructs. observe the postcard in your mind of the trauma construct. And when you make the right affirmation, the postcard will kind of disappear, or it'll be muted, or it'll change. So that's how good affirmations are made. You perceive somebody's trauma construct conceptually as a postcard, and then you play with different affirmations to overwrite it until one really hits home and you see the postcard disappear. Then you repeat that affirmation to them, and magic happens. So since these kind of blueprints and things are transmissible on the conceptual plane energetically, they kind of create conceptual realm technology in a way. So for example, if I healed lots of trauma in my kidney and then lots of trauma in my legs, I could tell you the story of releasing my scarcity trauma of the kidney, and that would have the signature of that. But I could also tell you the story of releasing my trauma about not being able to move properly for my legs, and that would contain the healing signature. And I could combine them in a sentence. I could make an affirmation that involved both of those archetypes, and that one affirmation would contain two healing blueprints for two different parts of the body. So it becomes kind of a conceptual layer technology that can be used by others. If I tell somebody this affirmation with two healing blueprints for the rest of their life, if they tell somebody else that same affirmation with those blueprints, the blueprints will transmit to them. So you can develop kind of conceptual realm technology, and it can be quite advanced as, you know, conceptual archetypes hold higher dimensional programming, and it's a really emerging and exotic and supernatural topic, but we have access to higher levels of technology in our consciousness that can be transmitted through words, which is quite powerful. Okay, another advanced topic is mental field structures. We talked about this in the first presentation, that, you know, a trauma construct in the organ isn't enough. The body also produces reactive behavioral patterns, these mental field structures, and they're kind of mental patterns, mental archetypal patterns that trigger under certain situations. But these mental field structures, they're archetypal behavioral patterns, but they're also represented bioenergetically as kind of clouds and rods and shapes sticking out of the skull and entering the mental field. They're kind of representation of bleeding across two different realms, and they're really easy to remove and deal with and interact with. It's quite an interesting process. They also get highly advanced. For example, there's a thing that's called a game bubble, and a game bubble is created when, let's say you're a kid and you're hiding inside of a box, and your family member is coming to spank you. You know you don't want to be seen, so you're hiding inside of enclosed space, and you're having this trauma of I don't want to be seen. In this case of I don't want to be seen, a trauma construct is created in the eyes, and what it does is it projects a mental field structure from the eyes to the surrounding area, and essentially creates some kind of like energetic perceptual bubble, which blocks perception coming in, blocks certain signatures of perception coming in, but at the same time, it also acts as a bubble around your perception, so you become kind of more autistic characteristics, and you become quite disconnected from reality, pushed away from reality. And these game bubbles can be popped, and all of a sudden you'll just snap back into reality. You'll be much more grounded. It'll fully change your perception. So it's worth thinking about all the times you had traumas around not wanting to be seen, and if any of them you were identifying your perception with an enclosed area around you. This can create a game bubble. It's also quite common with cell phones. If you're holding your phone and you have a trauma construct of not wanting to be seen while you're associating with your phone screen, a game bubble that's not quite a bubble, but a mental field structure will be projected from your eyes to your phone screen. So there'll be like an energetic funnel connecting the two. And it just makes it thousands of times easier to naturally look at your phone and engage with your phone if you're reassociating with that mental field structure whenever you use your phone. So it's something that cleans up perception quite a lot if you deal with this. These mental field structures, they can be pulled out quite easily. Usually you want to deal with the core trauma construct and they'll naturally dissolve, but it is possible to just pull them out directly and remove reactive behavioral patterns and remove trauma-based personality fragments. And really straightforward exercise. Just close your eyes and meditate and think about a time when you kind of glitched out, when you became like hyper aggressive or you became catatonic, or under a stress response you got really weird and you took on behaviors which didn't sound like you. You can step back into that memory, step into the shoes, and reassociate with the personality structure, with the mental field structure of that memory. And then as you're reassociating and triggering that shift in you from the memory over and over again, you're triggering the moment, you're reliving the moment over and over again where you had a reactive behavior. Just set the intention, I will see my mental field structure, and look up in your mind's eye and look at the space around your head. And as you kind of trigger this personality shift in your memory over and over again, you'll see like a white rod lighting up, sticking out of your head, or maybe it's like a cloud that's anchored to your head, and that's the representation of the mental field structure. And using intention and symbolism, you can remove it. Just take your hands like you're grabbing it, imagine touching it, try to feel it in your hand, and just fully set the intention to remove it. Believe in what you're doing, pull it out of your head, hold it in front of you, and imagine burning it with a violet flame. And very often your head will get very tight in that point and maybe start buzzing, and whatever organs were linked to that mental field structure, whatever core trauma construct created that, you'll tend to feel tension in those places. This is an incredibly powerful and empowering tool that you can use, and it's quite easy and doesn't always require finding the original memory of a trauma construct. Just finding the reactive behavioral pattern is often enough for these, but really the core trauma construct should be dealt with first to make it more sustainable and cleaner. Okay, another really advanced and highly contentious topic is what the kind of shamanic and new age communities call entities or demons. These are just a survival mechanism in consciousness, just like any other, and make quite a lot of intuitive sense when you think about them as holographic adaptive programs for consciousness. So basically, in situations where you have a trauma with a huge amount of sensory information, for example, you have one trauma and you're just so blackout drunk and you're on drugs and your body's toxicified, it's really like too much pain energy, too much toxicity energy to store in the sensory tract of that trauma. And so this can also happen if you have a number of traumas or consistently create trauma with the same sensory characteristics. Like if there's a damp house your grandma lives at and it's a really gross house with lots of mold, and every time you go there she's mean to you and develops trauma constructs, eventually this sensory tract of the mold and her vibration, etc., all combined, they're too much for the body to want to store. It doesn't like to store redundant sensory information. So what it does as an adaptive mechanism, when it's too much, either through one trauma having way too much energy in the sensory tract, or many traumas having the same energy, whenever there's just a bulk of the same sensory characteristics and trauma constructs, the body does something where it compresses that information. It compresses it down, and it compresses it into a very sleek form, but that form is given a consciousness component, and it's given some element of life force, of biophotonic energy. And this is a mechanism to, like I said, not store excessive pain in a body, but that pain needs to still be accessible. That sensory information needs to still be accessible for the trauma to become protective, for the consciousness, for you to become adaptive. And so it creates an intelligent energy out of this sensory information. And the purpose of giving it intelligence and life force is so it can dynamically move between the trauma constructs as needed and behave intelligently to restage the trauma or bring attention to the trauma in an attempt to heal. It's a mechanism of healing, really. So that's how they're created. They also mutate over time. Every time they're interacted with, they mutate slightly, which is the same for the conceptual plane. Every time you interact with a concept, that concept changes in a very small, tiny way, but there is like a overall mutation, adaptation of concepts and entities. Entities exist at a really unique level of consciousness. If consciousness was kind of a set of layers of reality on top of each other, all holographically representing the same thing, entities would exist at a layer that's running through all of them. It's perpendicular to them. And this kind of interactive layer, as I call it. And things get moved to this interactive layer when they need to kind of be given an intelligence and given a life force, because this layer contains every layer of reality. So you have some small amount of physical manifestation. You have this thing appearing in the astral plane, the conceptual plane, and your perception. And before an entity is even created, what's created is an energetic archetypal structure. So you have a sensory information in your trauma that's so powerful it can't be dealt with. It's first compressed down into an archetype. And this archetype is kind of a metaphysical structure, energetic field structure, and it's kind of a landing pad. This archetype is a landing pad for sensory information. And before an entity is created, there's an opportunity to just fill the landing pad with another entity that's close enough, that ticks the boxes to become adaptive and protect this trauma. And so often that can come from people around you. It can come from the environment. It can come through concepts. You know, a concept itself can hold intelligent energy in a way. So the point is that these entities, these demons, it's kind of a natural functioning system of the human body. It just runs away. For an example, addiction. Often in terms of personality structures and trauma constructs, many people get into smoking cigarettes, smoking cannabis, for example, and they do it partly because they have some traumas around nourishment. They have some traumas around connection to the mother. That's a really common setup. And so what happens is, as an adaptive mechanism, you're not being nourished energetically. You kind of create a archetype, kind of create a landing pad, a metaphysical structure that energetically nourishes you by connecting to nature, by connecting to tobacco, by connecting to cannabis, interacting with the plant spirit. And this is kind of this is a coping mechanism, somewhat healthy in that case. You occasionally smoke a cigarette to feel nourished when you just feel like something's missing. But what happens is you've kind of created a landing pad, and right now the entity that's attached to that landing pad is the plant spirit construct. But what can happen is you empower this landing pad, it mutates, you keep leaning on it, other traumas are created around it, and this landing pad mutates enough to where kind of the original setup that's somewhat healing is no longer accessible, and another entity, a darker entity with self-destructive kind of characteristics, takes its place. So you'll see this often in cannabis users. They'll start smoking cannabis. It'll be very childlike and fun and dreamy and seemingly healthy. And then almost overnight, after a certain amount of time, it'll get quite dark. They'll switch to other drugs. They'll have a much darker relationship to that type of nourishment. So this is kind of an example of how entities can become possessions in a way, and how this runaway adaptive mechanism, leads to these dark topics. So entities can exist across lots of different layers. It can exist across a range of frequency bands. Entities can exist only on the conceptual plane. It can be just a concept that's kind of taken on an energetic life of its own in response to trauma. So entities can exist across kind of a large frequency band. They can be super conceptual and just a concept that's taken on an energetic life of its own, or it can be quite in your perception. You always see things a certain kind of way. This is probably the most common. Your perception changes. You have some trauma around the kids making fun of you at school, and then it's so intense it self-assembles into an entity, and all of a sudden you're walking down the hallways and you just perceive everybody as like, wearing demon masks kind of perception. And this is an example of kind of an entity in the perceptual plane. They also exist in kind of biochemistry or the bioelectrical system. That's the deepest place an entity can live, is the electrical system. So this is kind of what happens over a lifetime. You develop a trauma when you're a baby. Let's say you didn't get enough milk. Your mouth has a trauma construct. Your stomach has a trauma construct. They link together in a constellation, and it's some adaptive mechanism about how you react to hunger and scarcity. And so what happens over time is this starts highly conceptual and affects your perception and your, concepts, your view of concepts. And over time, it gets pushed to the background of your consciousness, and it becomes bioelectrical. It only takes the kind of biological characteristics of the trauma construct and gives them a life of their own while pulling away from the consciousness layers. So the Taoists, the ancient Taoists, they super well understood the holographic nature of reality in the body, and they talk a lot about the three corpses in their immortality traditions, and Sun Tzu Mai and things around that kind of 700 AD, kind of the golden age of Taoist medicine before it got nationalized and kind of hijacked. They talk about the three corpses as basically ghosts or demons that live in the body. There's three of them, one in the head, one in the chest, one in the stomach. And they say that these things are involved in craving, and they shorten your lifespan, and they're the reason you age and your hair changes colors. And they have a number of biochemical methods to address them, and meditations, and they talk about them quite a lot in the study of demon medicine. So basically, these things, in my opinion, are electrical entities, trauma constructs. So basically, when you're in the womb and the umbilical cord seizes for a second, maybe the mother gets into a car accident or has a massive shock, for just a split second, you don't get any nourishment to your brain. You don't get any nourishment to your stomach. A number of channels are cut off, and this creates a trauma constellation, which is related to hunger. And over time, this kind of evolves just into a bioelectrical construct that's meant to be adaptive for your body. But this also is a self-parasitic construct. It's a trauma-based bioelectrical change. It's not healthy, and it's not required. It's just an adaptive response. So there seem to be these kind of constellations of really deep, primitive trauma around nourishment and connection kind of three main constellations in each part of the body. And these are these kind of electrical entities. So they're mostly bioelectrical, but they still have some element of consciousness. So you see a lot in the ancient texts. They talk about how these different three corpses will cause different types of craving and different types of seeking behaviors. And it makes a lot of sense in the kind of study of the holographic nature of consciousness, how that works. So in terms of electrical entities and healing entities, healing trauma constructs mechanistically, one thing that's really interesting to talk about is fever therapy. They found that just by injecting some bacterial fragments in somebody, just enough to create an immune response and trigger a fever, miracles happen with cancer. Cancers, in some cases, just spontaneously go into remission. So this is really kind of well used by alternative cancer community and was really promoted by a number of researchers and doctors in the last generation. Even some modern kind of pharmaceutical companies are developing products based off this. But the interesting thing about fever is it seems to be a bioenergetic reset mechanism. So you get a pathogenic signature inside of you, pathogenic energy. It lives in a trauma construct. At the same time you're sick, you develop a trauma. And so you have this kind of disease energy written into the sensory tract of your trauma, which will manifest physically. So the body triggers a fever, and what happens is it's not just your body temperature that goes up, your whole bioelectrical system goes into this ultra hot state. Hot is not about a temperature when you're talking about bioenergetics. This is really common also in the Taoist tradition. They talk about the heat and the cold balance of the body. And there should be kind of a dynamic balance with heat coming up from your kidneys, kind of boiling the water in the stomach, circulating in the lungs, condensing in the top of the chest, etc. This is kind of the natural bioenergetic cycle, this kind of cycle of nature that's represented fractally in the human body. But the thing about this heat is when your body's in a hot state, this is when trauma constructs very easily heal and very easily dissolve. A lot of times you can spontaneously reintegrate traumas just by going into a hot state. One way is having a fever. The other way is doing it biochemically. Niacin, particularly nicotinic acid form, it has to be nicotinic acid, causes a flushing effect. And this flushing is known to interact with kind of a biochemical system involved in the sense of heat, in the sense of touch. And niacin seems to be some type of unique bioenergetic supplement that just works miracles at high doses. Post-viral disease, chronic fatigue, many kind of complex trauma-based diseases will spontaneously reintegrate. And if I had a chronic health problem, I would try high-dose niacin kind of before anything. The Taoists were experts in this. They had a whole study of demon medicine. In fact, a lot of the original Chinese medicine, such as acupuncture, was developed conceptually for fighting demons. They say, you stab the demon heart with the needles. This was the original kind of creation of acupuncture. So they found a number of herbs. We translated a lot of these demon medicine formulas, hundreds of them, and ran word frequency analysis. And the plants that keep showing up in demon medicine are plants which affect the ion channels, which affect similar systems to niacin and this kind of sense of touch. So aconite is one medicine which is poisonous at high doses, but at low doses it has this bioelectrical warming effect. And just taking ultra low doses of aconite, that's enough to cause trauma to spontaneously reintegrate in many cases. They also use other compounds, including minerals. They have this famous 5 stones powder, which is a powder made of different ores, 5 different ores, of different poisonous metals. And scholars always thought the ancient Chinese were poisoning themselves, and there's a lot of writing about how this five stones powder was highly unpredictable and killed people. But if you look at the modern toxicity studies, the actual minerals they were using weren't acutely toxic. In fact, no toxicity was found in lab animals after taking cinnabar and realgar at the doses that they were taking daily with this five stones powder. What actually seemed to be happening is by ingesting so many different metallic minerals, you end up changing your kind of vibration, you end up changing your interaction to the antennas of consciousness, and this changes your relationship to trauma constructs. And this in itself can change the body. So you hear of stories of people using this five stones powder in ancient times, and they would take the powder and then somebody would have to pour water over their head for the next 5 hours to prevent them from bioenergetically overheating. So this kind of medicine is highly unpredictable, very dangerous. Nobody should use it, but it's a very interesting case study for how kind of you can treat the body's bioelectrical system with unique class of drugs, such as ion channel modifying poisons, mineral medicines, and things like niacin. Lobelia is a really good one. It's known to be kind of a purgative, but it kind of has an energetic lubrication effect, and trauma constructs can just kind of melt away or easily leave you through purging, which is kind of the common use of it. You literally throwing up trauma constructs, because physical throwing up is also echoed on the energetic plane, has removal of some energetic bubble. Things like shaking exercises, trauma release exercises, TRE, are helpful for kind of lubricating and removing trauma constructs. Iboga is probably the kind of most powerful trauma plastinogen. I guess that's what I call them, trauma plastinogens. They change the relationship to trauma constructs. They make them more plastic. Iboga kind of does three things. It makes your perception more conceptual, so it's easier to access kind of conceptual shock traumas. It has an effect on pulling up suppressed memories or pulling up memories from cellular memory. For example, on certain doses of Iboga, around 3 grams or so, you see people just tune into their part of their body which is having an issue, and then spontaneously they'll remember the memory of where that body part got traumatized. And the third thing that it does is it transmutates the trauma energy. It needs to be released through crying or through toxicity, etc., but somehow Iboga allows it to be released etherically from the breath. So it's an incredibly powerful tool, the most powerful tool for this work. But it's unpredictable, it's unsafe to use without kind of knowing what you're doing, and there are professional clinics that do these kinds of things under medical monitoring that you can contact if you're interested in these topics.